In the name of the one God who is creating, redeeming, and sustaining us, amen. Please be seated. Well, good morning. I am so happy to be with you today. Y'all may know that I grew up in this parish, and I was here in February preaching, and but when I was here last February, it had been, I think, 20 years since I'd been back to Fayetteville. We don't have people here anymore, and so when Lowell invited me back in February to come now, to be able to come so soon, I was just so happy. So I'm just delighted to be here with you, and I just want you to know that when I accepted his invitation, that was before I knew you were going to feed me biscuits and gravy. Who was here for that feast? Oh, nice. That was so great. Of course, I also didn't know what the readings were going to be for this morning. Well, those are quite something for Stewardship Sunday. All right, here we go. Let's just start with Exodus. Okay, so here's what's going on in Exodus. People are kind of wigging out a little bit because Moses has been gone for a while. He's up on the mountain having his little chat with God, and he's been gone literally for weeks, and they're just kind of freaking out about this. And so the people go to Aaron. What do we do? And Aaron comes up with this brilliant idea that I guess he thinks is going to be comforting to people, right? To take all their gold, melt it down, and turn it into a statue that they can all worship. Not really a surprise that God is livid with them about this. But I actually think that that's helpful to us today because clearly the message is that God doesn't want us to bring our gold anywhere near church, lest we get confused about what it is that we really are worshiping. In fact, just to be on the safe side, I advise that when you come to church, you just leave your wallets at home. Don't bring any currency of any kind into this sanctuary. Lowell, that's pretty much the message you had in mind when you asked me to come, am I right? I'm kidding. Obviously, that is not our message for this morning because the gospel goes in a completely different direction. Here, we have a guy who shows up to take part in God's lavish feast, and he gets thrown out for not being appropriately dressed. I think we can all see where this is going. Jesus wants us to establish a committee of bouncers who sit in the nave and decide whether or not anybody can come into the church based on their fashion sensibility. In fact, just to be helpful, I've already started drawing up a little list of fashion criteria here, and I also made a sign-up sheet for anybody who wants to join the committee. And if you don't mind, when you put your name down, if you could also just list any bouncer experience that you have and how much you can bench press. Okay. How am I doing, Lowell? All right, keep going here. Okay, truth is, maybe it's not me, but it seems to me that in both of these readings, the God that we hear about is a little harsh. God's going to consume the people of Israel. God's going to destroy those murderers and burn their city to the ground. This plays into a very conventional read on the Christian tradition, which is that we worship a wrathful, vindictive God. Now, I don't want to make any assumptions about anybody who is here this morning, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that this is not, in fact, how most of us view God. So I want to ask you, truthfully, how much do you really believe that God steps into our world at all? I mean, sure, maybe you've experienced God showing up in subtle moments when you're struggling and you need an emotional lift. But, you know, we live in a world right now that is in chronic crisis. And what is God doing about it? Do you believe that God is going to rain generators down on the people of Puerto Rico? No. And why? Because we know that's not how God operates. But this creates a problem for us in a world where there is so much suffering, where there is so much hate-filled violence. For God not to show up visibly, forcibly, makes God look feckless, weak, and irresponsible. So let's get honest. If you believe that God is an actual force in our world with actual power, how does that power work? What is our relationship to it? How do we engage it and help bring it to bear on the intractable challenges that we face? With these questions in view, let's take a look at our gospel reading this morning. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a king throwing a wedding feast for his son. The king sends servants to call the guests who ignore the invitation. The king sends more servants with a more insistent message. Tell them, oxen, fatted calves, everything is ready. These would-be guests seem to be of a mind that this king's hospitality is lame. Some of them are so outright disdainful of the king's power that they become violent, taunting his servants and killing them. When the king becomes violent in turn, he's demonstrating that though he is generous, he is not weak. He can use his power to throw extravagant feasts for his friends, or he can use his power to wipe entire cities off the face of the earth. Either way, the message is, don't underestimate this God. In the story, the king is done with his loser friends. So he sends his servants out into the streets to call anyone they come across, no filters. Soon, the banquet hall is filled to the brim. And here the story takes an interesting turn. The king comes into the banquet hall to gaze with satisfaction upon his guests. Now this is what he wanted to see. Hundreds of people reclining at tables, oohing and eyeing at his impeccable taste, the meat, the grapes, the wine from his personal vineyard. But wait, who's that guy in his undershirt? Once again, the king goes ballistic. There's a big debate in liberal theological circles about whether this man could have even gotten a robe on his own or not. After all, the guests were summoned from the streets. Maybe he didn't have time to get a robe. You know what? This is exactly the kind of mealy-mouthed excuse that makes us look like theological wimps and makes our God look like an arbitrarily violent jerk. The Greek basically translates like this: the man had not put on the thing you put on. Everybody else in that hall came off the street too, and every one of them is wearing the thing you put on. When I look at this guy through my Arkansas lens, this is what I see. He's the guy who wears his sneakers without socks. And when it rains, he stomps around in the puddles and he never lets his shoes dry, and those are the shoes that he wears to the wedding. And you know how they smell. It's not that he's poor and he doesn't have other shoes. He just couldn't be bothered to put on a better pair. And you just know that the first thing he does when he reclines at that table is that he kicks those shoes off, and the smell is all anyone can focus on. After all the poor king has been through, he just loses it. And frankly, I don't blame him. Okay, maybe the king's response is a bit over the top. What is Jesus saying here? Remember that the setting for the parable is a wedding feast. The word wedding appears 8 times in this passage, which is noteworthy given that Jesus spends 0 time talking about the couple who are getting married. The Greek word for wedding is from an ancient root that means to join or to bind. To describe the kingdom of heaven, Jesus conjures an image of a huge, opulent party with one central purpose: to bring people together, people who are making a commitment to each other. These people have to put an effort into making this relationship work, keeping this family alive and intact. When you and I are invited into the kingdom, this is part of what we take on. Yes, it is a free and open invitation to an unimaginably lavish feast. But we have to put energy into claiming it. When this guy shows up, not having done the most basic thing, wearing designated robe, he isn't taking up his part. And when the rest of us have to deal with his stinky feet, it distracts us from our work, and our entire mission is diluted. In the story, the king orders this man's hands and feet to be bound. Jesus talks about wailing and gnashing of teeth in other places, but this is the only time that he inserts this business about binding someone's hands, which means the binding takes place against the backdrop of a wedding. It's an inversion, which I think is akin to the inversion that we saw earlier on, when the king's murderous rage against a people gets aroused because the people themselves have committed murder. The idea here is that we have power to set certain dynamics in motion. If we use our power to commit violence, violence will almost certainly come back to us. Flip side. If we fail to use our power, sorry, my hands are tied, then our hands may become literally, in a sense, tied. Having failed to bring people together, we'll find ourselves cast aside from the cosmic effort to effect reconciliation. The challenge of our faith has always been to demonstrate the power of a God who does not use power in any conventional or militaristic sense. But first, we have to believe in the power we proclaim. It's fine for us to reject fire and brimstone. This parable calls us out on whatever tendency we might have to believe that God's power is really just a bunch of mealy-mouthed, feckless crap. Great for the feel-good moment, but impact the world? Not so much. My friends, it is our job as Christians to show the world that the power of God is a real thing, to make it plainly, graphically, authentically visible in the world. We do this primarily by building Christian communities of strength and courage and deep care. We do this by claiming our power and using it well, both inside our walls and outside in our witness. We do this by building communities where justice is a real force, where hospitality is lavish, offered freely to people who are hungry to claim it. St. Paul's is already such a place. You witness to these things in your commitment to ministries like Magdalene House. You witness to it when you stand with LGBTQ people to counter the violence of a false gospel. You witness to it when you bear each other up through hard times. And when you gather to worship God with such beauty and such joy. Today is a day set aside for us to declare our commitment to this place. A big part of that involves a financial commitment, as you know. For many of us, St. Paul's is not some random charity. It is our community, our home. And it matters for us to take responsibility for its overall health in the same way that we take responsibility for the homes we each live in and for the family members who depend on us. I'm something of a prodigal daughter here, and I cannot express how deeply it affected me when I showed up here in February and saw that the home that had nurtured me so well with such love is, if anything, even stronger than it was when I was a child here. You know, I live in New York, and every once in a while I hear about something that St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas has done all the way up in New York. I know that you take the financial part of your commitment seriously, and just please know how deeply grateful I am, and so many people, for keeping this place alive and healthy. So I hope that you don't think me ungrateful when I tell you that I am here to ask even more of you above and beyond your financial commitment. St. Paul's is in the midst of a big transition with Lowell about to leave. This can be a time when some parishes falter, and I am asking you to keep St. Paul's strong. I am asking you, each one of you, personally, to sustain a community that is so healthy, so alive, so filled with dignity and integrity that the power of God is plainly evident to anyone who sees you. I am asking you to continue to build a community that you want to invest in. Not because this is a place where God's power is a nice idea or a pleasant diversion or an occasional feel-good moment, but because this is a place where the power of God is a force to be reckoned with, and we reckon with it, and we make it visible every single day of our lives. Amen.